What if I told you that sometimes people just vanish? Not in movies, not in fiction, in real life. An entire colony of settlers, a decorated pilot, three women from a quiet house in Missouri. And despite everything we know, despite all our technology and databases and forensic science, we still have no idea what happened to them. Tonight, we're going to explore 25 of the most mysterious unsolved cases in US history. Stories about people who disappeared without explanation, crimes that were never solved, mysteries that have haunted investigators for decades or even centuries. These aren't urban legends or ghost stories. These are real cases, verified facts, genuine mysteries that remain open to this day. So get comfortable, maybe grab a cup of tea, turn down the lights. Let's begin with a colony that vanished into the Carolina wilderness, leaving behind only a single carved word. The lost colony of Roanoke, 1590. So here's the thing about disappearing acts. Most of them have explanations. Someone saw something, someone left a note, there's a trail, a witness, a body, something. But sometimes, and I mean very rarely, an entire colony of people just vanishes into the humid North Carolina air like they were never there at all. And you're left standing 400 years later, still wondering what on earth happened. In 1587, 117 English settlers decided that Roanoke Island was going to be their new home. Picture it: sandy shores, dense forests, the promise of a fresh start in the new world. They built homes, they planted crops, they were doing the whole colonial thing. Their governor, a man named John White, had a granddaughter born there, Virginia Dare, the first English child born in the Americas. That's the kind of detail that makes you think this settlement was meant to last, you know? This wasn't just a trading post, these were families. But then Governor White had to leave. England needed supplies, and someone had to sail back across the Atlantic to get them. So, in 1587, he left his entire colony behind, promising to return as quickly as possible. Now, here's where things get complicated in that uniquely 16th century way. England was at war with Spain. Ships were needed for fighting, not for resupplying a small colony thousands of miles away. White couldn't get back. Not in 1588, not in 1589. He was stuck watching the years tick by. Knowing his family and friends were waiting for him across an ocean he couldn't cross. Finally, in 1590, 3 entire years later, he made it back to Roanoke. And when he arrived, the island was silent. Not the peaceful kind of silent, the wrong kind. The settlement was deserted. Houses were dismantled carefully, not destroyed. No bodies, no graves, no signs of a struggle or a hasty retreat, just emptiness. And carved into a wooden post at the fort's entrance was a single word: Croatoan. Now that word actually meant something. Croatoan was the name of a nearby island, about 50 miles south. It was also the name of a local Native American tribe, people who had been friendly with the colonists. White had actually arranged with the settlers before he left that if they needed to relocate, they should carve the name of their destination. If they were in danger, they were supposed to add a Maltese cross. There was no cross, just the word. White wanted to sail to Croatoan Island immediately. Of course he did. His family was missing. But a storm was rolling in, his crew was exhausted, and the ship's captain refused. They had to return to England. White never made it back to North America. He never found out what happened to those 117 people, including his daughter and granddaughter. For over 400 years, people have been trying to solve this mystery. Theories range from practical to terrifying. Maybe the colonists integrated with the Croatoan tribe. There's actually some archaeological evidence for this. English artifacts, objects that match the time period, have been found on Hatteras Island. which used to be called Croatoan. Some researchers point to certain family names among the Lumbee people of North Carolina that match Roanoke colonists, but there's no definitive proof, no smoking gun, no written record saying here's what happened. Other theories are darker. Disease could have wiped them out, though you'd expect to find graves. Spanish raiders might have attacked, though, again, where are the bodies? Some historians think they tried to sail back to England themselves and were lost at sea. Others believe they moved inland and were killed in conflicts with other tribes. Every theory has holes. Every explanation leaves questions. And so the lost colony of Roanoke remains exactly that. Lost. It's America's oldest unsolved mystery, a puzzle carved into a wooden post that's been rotting in the humid air for centuries. Somewhere in the soil of North Carolina, there might be answers, or maybe there aren't. Maybe some disappearances are just meant to stay mysterious. But of course, Roanoke wasn't the only time something valuable vanished without a trace. The Amber Room, 1945. If you've ever lost your keys and spent 20 minutes retracing your steps, imagine losing an entire room. Not the furniture in a room. The actual room itself. Walls and all. Now imagine that room is worth over $500 million and is considered one of the most beautiful creations in human history. That's the Amber Room, and it's been missing since 1945. The Amber Room wasn't just decorated with amber. It was made of amber. 6 tons of it. Imagine 11-foot tall panels of honey-colored, translucent amber, backed with gold leaf and mirrors, are all fitted together like the world's most expensive jigsaw puzzle. It took craftsmen over a decade to build, starting in 1701. Originally created for the King of Prussia, it was given as a gift to Peter the Great of Russia in 1716. For over 2 centuries, it sat in the Catherine Palace near St. Petersburg, glowing in the candlelight, absolutely breathtaking. Then came World War II, and with it, the Nazis. In 1941, German forces invaded the Soviet Union and reached the Catherine Palace. Soviet curators had tried to hide the Amber Room by covering it with wallpaper. Wallpaper. As if 6 tons of amber could be disguised by some floral print. The Germans found it immediately. They disassembled the entire room, panel by panel, packed it into 27 crates, and shipped it to Königsberg Castle in what was then East Prussia, now Kaliningrad, Russia. For a while, the Amber Room was displayed there, a trophy of war. Visitors came to see it. There are records, photographs even, of it sitting in the castle. But by 1944, the Soviets were advancing and the Germans were retreating. The room was reportedly disassembled again and hidden. And then, in August of 1945, British bombers destroyed much of Königsberg Castle. When Soviet forces arrived to sift through the rubble, the Amber Room was gone. Now here's where it gets truly maddening. For decades, treasure hunters, governments, and obsessed individuals have searched for it. The CIA looked. The KGB looked. Private expeditions with metal detectors and ground-penetrating radar have combed through forests, mines, and castle ruins. Some believe the room was destroyed in the bombing, burned to nothing, or crushed under tons of stone. That's the simplest explanation, but there's no evidence. No fragments of amber, no melted gold, nothing. Other theories are more elaborate. Some say it was loaded onto a ship that sank in the Baltic Sea. Others claim it was hidden in an abandoned mine shaft in Germany or Poland. There are stories of trains disappearing into tunnels, of secret Nazi bunkers, of coded messages left by dying soldiers. Every few years, someone announces they've found it. Then the claim falls apart under scrutiny. What makes the Amber Room's disappearance so haunting is how recent it is. This isn't ancient history. There are still people alive whose parents might have seen it. We have photographs of it. We know what it looked like, where it was, and roughly when it vanished. And yet, despite all our modern technology, despite satellites and databases and international cooperation, we cannot find an 11-foot tall room made of glowing amber. In 2003, Russia completed a reconstruction of the Amber Room using old photographs and descriptions. It sits in the Catherine Palace now, beautiful and perfect, a replica of something lost. But the original, the real room, the one that took a decade to build and survived, 2 centuries before disappearing in the chaos of war, remains one of history's greatest missing treasures. And speaking of things that vanished in ways that make absolutely no sense, let me tell you about a fire that didn't burn quite the way fires are supposed to. The Solder Children, 1945, Christmas Eve, 1945, Fayetteville, West Virginia. The Solder family's house caught fire just after midnight. Now, house fires are tragic, but they usually follow a certain logic. Fire spreads. People escape or they don't. Remains are found. There's a pattern, a horrible but understandable sequence of events. The Solder fire didn't follow that pattern. Not even close. George and Jenny Solder had 10 children. When the fire started, they managed to get out of the house along with 4 of the kids. But 5 children, Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty, were still inside. The ages ranged from 5 to 14. George tried to go back in, but the stairs had already collapsed. He tried to use a ladder. Both ladders that were usually leaning against the house were missing. He tried to move one of his trucks to climb on the roof. Neither truck would start, despite working perfectly the day before. The fire department didn't arrive for 7 hours. 7 hours. By the time they got there, the house had burned to the ground. Here's what you'd expect to find. Remains. Bones. Teeth. Something. Fire doesn't erase human bodies completely, especially not a fire from a wooden house that burns relatively quickly. The fire chief himself said the fire wasn't hot enough to cremate bodies. Cremation requires sustained temperatures of around 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit. House fires don't reach that. They don't stay that hot for that long. But when they sifted through the ashes and debris, there was nothing. No bones, no teeth, no fragments of the 5 missing children. The fire chief declared it was because the fire had been so intense. But George Solder didn't buy it. He couldn't. The fire had lasted maybe 2 hours before the house collapsed completely. And there were other strange details piling up. Details that didn't fit the narrative of a tragic accident. A few weeks before the fire, a life insurance salesman had stopped by. George had declined his services. The salesman got angry and said George's house would go up in smoke and his children would be destroyed. He'd said the mafia would make sure of it. George had dismissed it as a bizarre threat from a rejected salesman. After the fire, it sounded different. On the night of the fire, Jenny had been woken by a loud bang on the roof and the sound of something rolling across it. Then she heard a fire start. The phone lines had been cut. A driver passing by at the time later said he'd seen balls of fire being thrown onto the roof. A woman in a nearby town claimed she saw the Solder children in a passing car the morning after the fire. A waitress in South Carolina said she'd served a group of children resembling the Solder kids weeks later, accompanied by adults who wouldn't let them speak. George and Jenny hired private investigators. They put up a billboard on Route 60 with photos of the 5 children, asking anyone with information to come forward. That billboard stayed up for decades. The family never stopped believing their children had been taken, not killed. They pursued leads across the country, chasing rumors and sightings that never led anywhere concrete. In 1967, Jenny received a photograph in the mail. no return address. It showed a young man who looked remarkably like what Louis Sauter might have looked like as an adult. On the back was written Louis Sauter, followed by some cryptic numbers. They hired a detective to trace it. He took their money and disappeared. They never heard from him again. The case was never solved. The 5 children were never found, alive or dead. George Sauter died in 1969, still believing his children had been kidnapped. Jenny died in 1989. The surviving Sauter siblings still talk about that night, about the fire that didn't leave any trace of their brothers and sisters, about the questions that have haunted their family for nearly 80 years. And if you think a mystery from 1945 is frustrating, well, let me introduce you to a man who jumped out of an airplane in 1971 and turned into a ghost. D.B. Cooper, 1971. Thanksgiving Eve, 1971. Northwest Orient Flight, 305, Portland to Seattle. A man in a dark suit and sunglasses bought a ticket under the name Dan Cooper. He sat in the back, ordered a bourbon and soda, and lit a cigarette. This was the 70s. You could do that on planes. Everything about him seemed normal, unremarkable, forgettable, until he handed a note to a flight attendant. The note said he had a bomb. The flight attendant, Florence Schaffner, thought it was a passenger hitting on her. It happened all the time. She didn't even read it at first, just tucked it into her pocket. Cooper leaned over and said, "You better look at that. I have a bomb." So she looked. And then she sat down next to him, and he opened his briefcase just enough for her to see wires, red cylinders, and a battery. It looked real. Real enough. Cooper's demands were specific. He wanted $200,000 in $20 bills, 4 parachutes, and a fuel truck standing by in Seattle. In exchange, he'd release the passengers when the plane landed. The airline agreed. The FBI agreed. What else could they do? The plane circled over Seattle for about 2 hours while someone gathered the money in parachutes. When they landed, Cooper let all 36 passengers off, along with 2 of the flight attendants. He kept the pilot, co-pilot, and 1 attendant. Then he ordered the crew to fly to Mexico City. But there were conditions. The plane had to stay below 10,000 feet. The landing gear had to stay down. The cabin had to remain unpressurized. The crew, reasonably confused, agreed. They took off heading south, somewhere over the dense forests of the Pacific Northwest. Probably near the Washington-Oregon border, Cooper did something absolutely insane. He lowered the rear stairs of the plane, strapped on a parachute, grabbed the money, and jumped into the night. It was raining. It was dark. The temperature was probably around 7 degrees below zero at that altitude. He was jumping into wilderness, into forests and rivers and mountains, wearing a business suit and loafers. The crew didn't even realize he'd jumped until they noticed a pressure change in the cabin. By the time they landed in Reno and checked the plane, Cooper was gone. So was the money. 1 parachute remained. The FBI launched one of the most extensive manhunts in American history. They searched hundreds of square miles of wilderness. They interviewed hundreds of people. They followed thousands of tips. They found nothing. Not a body. Not a parachute. Not a shred of evidence. For 9 years, it was like D.B. Cooper had never existed. Then in February of 1980, an 8-year-old boy named Brian Ingram was digging a fire pit on a beach along the Columbia River. He found 3 packets of $20 bills, rotted and torn, buried in the sand. The serial numbers matched Cooper's ransom money, $5,800. That's it. That's the only physical trace of D.B. Cooper ever found. The discovery raised more questions than it answered. How did the money get to the Columbia River, miles from the suspected jump zone? If Cooper landed in the river and drowned, where's the rest of the money? Where's his body? If he survived, why would he bury the money and leave it? Nothing made sense. Over the decades, dozens of people have been suspected. A few deathbed confessions have been made. None has been confirmed. In 2016, the FBI officially closed the case, saying they'd exhausted all credible leads. But they didn't say Cooper died. They didn't say he survived. They just said they didn't know. And so D.B. Cooper remains the only unsolved case of air piracy in American history. A man who walked onto a plane, extorted a fortune, and jumped into a storm, vanishing so completely that 50 years later, we still don't know his real name. Which brings us to another man who loved sending messages but never revealed his identity. The Zodiac Killer, 1968 to 1969. Northern California, late 1960s. People were being killed and someone wanted credit for it. Not just credit, attention, control. The Zodiac Killer didn't just murder, he turned his crimes into a performance, sending letters to newspapers like he was penning reviews of his own work. And the truly maddening part, he was never caught. The confirmed Zodiac murders began in December of 1968. A young couple, Betty Lou Jensen and David Faraday, were shot and killed on a quiet road near Benicia, California. 7 months later, another couple, Darlene Farron and Mike Mageau, were shot in a parking lot in Vallejo. Farron died. Mageau survived and described the attacker. 2 weeks after that attack, 3 letters arrived at Bay Area newspapers. Each contained 1/3 of a coded cipher and a message from someone claiming responsibility for the murders. He called himself the Zodiac. The first cipher was cracked by a schoolteacher and his wife within a week. It was a rambling message about killing people for sport, about collecting souls for the afterlife. It was disturbing, grandiose, and bizarre. And it was just the beginning. Over the next few years, the Zodiac sent dozens of letters to police and journalists. Some contained ciphers, some contained scraps of a victim's clothing as proof. Some contained threats to commit mass murder, including plans to bomb a school bus full of children. In September of 1969, the Zodiac attacked again. Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard were picnicking at Lake Berryessa when a man approached wearing an executioner-style hood with a white cross and circle symbol. He tied them up and stabbed them repeatedly. Shepard died. Hartnell survived and described the attack in detail. Before leaving, the killer wrote on Hartnell's car door, listing his victims and the dates. 2 weeks later, Saranuri taxi driver Paul Stein was shot in San Francisco. The Zodiac sent a piece of Stein's bloodstained shirt to the San Francisco Chronicle to prove he'd done it. He also mocked the police for failing to catch him, despite witnesses seeing him leave the scene. It was the last confirmed Zodiac murder. But the letters continued. He claimed to have killed 37 people, though only 5 deaths have been definitively linked to him. He sent ciphers, including one that wouldn't be solved for 51 years. In 2020, a team of code breakers finally cracked the so-called 340 cipher. It didn't reveal his identity. It was another rambling message, more taunting, more theatrics. The investigation involved thousands of suspects. Fingerprints were lifted from letters. DNA was collected from envelope seals. Handwriting was analyzed. Composite sketches were created. The case consumed decades of law enforcement resources, and still, nothing definitive. Every promising lead eventually fizzled. Every suspect was ruled out or couldn't be proven. To this day, the Zodiac case remains open with the San Francisco Police Department. There are still investigators working on it, still people analyzing those letters, still cryptographers trying to crack the remaining unsolved ciphers. Somewhere in some file or database, there might be the name of the Zodiac killer. Or maybe there isn't. Maybe he's just a ghost in the machine. Jimmy Hoffa, 1975, July 30th, 1975, Bloomfield Hills, Michigan. The parking lot of the Machus Red Fox restaurant, 2:45 in the afternoon. James Riddle Hoffa, former president of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, one of the most powerful and controversial labor leaders in American history, was waiting for a meeting. He was last seen standing near a phone booth. Then he was gone, just gone. And nearly 50 years later, nobody knows where. Now, Jimmy Hoffa wasn't just anybody. This was a man who'd built the Teamsters into one of the largest and most influential unions in the country. He'd negotiated with presidents. He'd been investigated by Robert Kennedy. He'd served time in federal prison for jury tampering and fraud before being pardoned by President Nixon. He was connected, powerful, and according to many, he had deep ties to organized crime. When someone like that disappears, it's not usually an accident. So, Hoffa had been released from prison in 1971 with one major condition. He couldn't participate in union activities until 1980. But Hoffa being Hoffa, he wasn't the type to sit quietly on the sidelines. He was trying to regain control of the Teamsters. He was making calls, setting up meetings, pushing back against the people who'd taken his place. That's why he was at the Machus Red Fox that day. He was supposed to meet with two organized crime figures, Anthony Provenzano, a Teamsters official from New Jersey, and Anthony Giacalone, a Detroit mobster. The meeting was allegedly to settle disputes and smooth over tensions. Except neither Provenzano nor Giacalone showed up. Or rather, they both had alibis proving they were nowhere near the restaurant. Provenzano was in New Jersey. Giacalone was at a health club with witnesses. Hoffa called his wife around 2:30 to say the men were late. By 3:30, he still hadn't come home. By that evening, his family knew something was wrong. Hoffa was disciplined, punctual. He didn't just disappear without calling. The FBI got involved immediately. The car Hoffa had been driving was found in the restaurant parking lot. It had been locked. No signs of struggle, no blood. Just an empty car in an empty parking lot. From there, the investigation spiraled into one of the longest and most exhaustive missing persons cases in American history. Hundreds of agents, thousands of interviews, countless theories. And the theories. Oh, the theories. Everyone had one. Some said Hoffa had been killed and his body dissolved in acid. Others claimed he'd been buried under the old Giant Stadium in New Jersey, a rumor so persistent that in 2010, the FBI actually brought in ground-penetrating radar to check. They found nothing. Another theory involved a horse farm in Michigan. They dug that up too. Nothing. There were stories about mob hits, about his body being crushed in a car compactor, about him being buried in concrete somewhere in Detroit. Every few years, someone comes forward with a new tip, a new location, a new explanation. And every time it leads nowhere. In 1982, 7 years after his disappearance, Hoffa was declared legally dead. But declaring someone dead and finding their body are very different things. His family never got closure. The people who likely knew what happened, mobsters and Teamsters officials from that era, are mostly dead now themselves. Some went to their graves insisting they knew nothing. A few hinted they knew everything but would never talk. What makes the Hoffa case so enduring isn't just the mystery of where his body is. It's what his disappearance represents. Here was a man who'd stood toe-to-toe with the most powerful people in the country, who'd built an empire, who seemed untouchable. And in a parking lot on a summer afternoon, he vanished as completely as if he'd never existed. No body, no witnesses, no justice. To this day, the case remains open. The FBI still accepts tips. Investigators still follow leads. Somewhere maybe buried under asphalt or concrete or dirt, Jimmy Hoffa might be resting. Or maybe he isn't. Maybe the truth disappeared with him. And speaking of cases where someone vanished in ways that still haunt investigators decades later, let me tell you about a young woman whose death became one of the most infamous, unsolved murders in Los Angeles history. The Black Dahlia, 1947, January 15th, 1947. A vacant lot at 39th and Norton in Los Angeles. A mother walking with her young daughter spotted what she thought was a mannequin, lying in the weeds, broken in half. It wasn't a mannequin. It was the body of Elizabeth Short, a 22-year-old woman who would become known to history as the Black Dahlia. And what happened to her remains one of the most disturbing and puzzling murder cases America has ever seen. Elizabeth Short had moved to California from Massachusetts, like so many young women in the 1940s, chasing dreams of stardom and sunshine. She'd been staying with friends, moving between apartments, trying to make something of herself in a city that chewed up hopefuls and spit them out. She was last seen alive on January 9th at the Biltmore Hotel in downtown Los Angeles. 6 days later, she was found in that vacant lot, and the condition of her body shocked even hardened homicide detectives. Her body had been severed at the waist and drained of blood. Her face had been cut from the corners of her mouth toward her ears. She'd been posed deliberately, lying on her back in the grass. The crime scene was meticulous, calculated, and utterly chilling. Whoever did this had taken their time. The body had been washed clean. There was no blood at the scene, which meant she'd been killed somewhere else and transported. The level of care taken to stage the scene suggested someone who either wanted to send a message or who had a very specific, very disturbing purpose. The press descended immediately. The case became a media sensation, covered in lurid detail by every newspaper in Los Angeles. Elizabeth Short was given the nickname the Black Dahlia, reportedly because she'd been seen wearing black clothing and because there was a film noir called The Blue Dahlia in theaters at the time. The nickname stuck, turning a real person into a tabloid character, a symbol more than a human being. The investigation was massive. The LAPD interviewed hundreds of suspects. They followed thousands of leads. The case file grew to enormous proportions, becoming one of the most investigated crimes in the department's history. And yet, despite all that effort, no one was ever arrested. No one was ever charged. The killer was never identified. What made the case even more bizarre was the involvement of someone claiming to be the murderer. Days after the body was found, newspapers and police began receiving items in the mail. A package arrived at the Los Angeles Examiner containing Elizabeth Short's belongings. Her birth certificate, business cards, photographs, an address book with the name Mark Hansen embossed on the cover. The items had been cleaned with gasoline, presumably to remove fingerprints. A note made from letters cut out of newspapers read, "Here is Dahlia's belongings. Letter to follow." And letters did follow. Dozens of them over the years, some claiming to be from the killer, others clearly from attention seekers. Some contained details only the killer could know. Others were obvious hoaxes. The real killer, if they were among the letter writers, was impossible to identify amid the noise. The case attracted confessions too. Over 60 people confessed to the murder at various times. All were investigated, none checked out. Theories have persisted for decades. Some focused on a surgeon or someone with medical knowledge, given the precision of the crime. Others pointed to various men Elizabeth Short had known or been seen with in the days before her death. One name that surfaces often is George Hodel, a Los Angeles doctor. His son, a former LAPD detective, became convinced his father was the killer and wrote extensively about it. But even that theory, despite being compelling and detailed, has never been definitively proven. The Black Dahlia case remains unsolved. Elizabeth Short's killer was never found. Her death became a cultural touchstone, inspiring books, films, and endless speculation. But underneath all the mythology and media coverage was a real person, a 22-year-old woman who came to Los Angeles looking for something better and instead became one of history's most tragic mysteries. And if you think that case generated attention, wait until you hear about three children who disappeared from a beach and changed the way the world thinks about child safety. The Beaumont children, 1966, January the 26th, 1966, Australia Day, Glenelg Beach, Adelaide, Australia. Now, I know this isn't technically an American case, but stay with me because what happened to the Beaumont children changed child safety policies worldwide, including here in the United States. And the mystery itself is so profoundly unsettling that it deserves a place in any discussion of unsolved disappearances. Jane Beaumont was 9 years old. Her sister Arnya was 7. Their brother Grant was 4. That morning, their parents let them take a 5-minute bus ride to the beach. It was a decision thousands of parents made every summer day in 1966. The world felt safer then, or at least people believed it was. The children had made the trip before. They knew the area. They were supposed to return home by 2 in the afternoon. 2 o'clock came and went, then 3, then 4. By evening, Jim and Nancy Beaumont knew something was terribly wrong. They contacted police, and what began as a missing children report quickly became one of the largest search operations in Australian history. Hundreds of volunteers combed the beach, the surrounding areas, the water. Police interviewed witnesses, and a picture began to emerge, one that made the case even more disturbing. Multiple witnesses reported seeing the Beaumont children that day playing with a tall, blond man in his 30s. He'd been seen buying them food, playing with them in the water, even helping Jane dig in the sand. The children seemed comfortable with him, not frightened or coerced. They appeared to be having fun. One witness saw them leaving the beach with this man, walking toward a nearby park. After that, nothing. The children and the man vanished. Despite the eyewitness accounts and the massive search effort, no trace of the Beaumont children was ever found. No bodies, no clothing, no evidence of what happened after they left that beach. The investigation followed every lead imaginable. Psychics were consulted, suspects were interrogated, locations were excavated based on tips. Nothing came of any of it. The case gripped Australia and sent shockwaves around the world. Parents everywhere suddenly realized how vulnerable their children were. The idea that 3 kids could be abducted in broad daylight from a public beach, with witnesses nearby, fundamentally changed how people thought about safety. In the United States, the case became a reference point for child protection advocates. It influenced the development of stranger danger education, the creation of missing children databases, and the way law enforcement handles child abduction cases. Over the decades, several suspects have been investigated. One man, a known predator, was questioned extensively, but nothing could be proven. Deathbed confessions have been made and later discredited. Locations have been searched based on supposed credible information. In 2018, police excavated a factory site after receiving a tip. They found nothing. Every lead, no matter how promising, has led to a dead end. Jim Beaumont died in 2009, never knowing what happened to his children. Nancy lived until she was 92, passing away in 2019. She spent over 50 years hoping for answers, for closure, for anything. She never got it. The Beaumont children remain missing. The man seen with them on the beach was never identified. The case remains open, though realistically, after nearly 60 years, the chances of solving it grow slimmer with each passing year. What makes the Beaumont case so haunting is its simplicity. 3 children went to the beach and never came home. That's it. No complicated conspiracy, no elaborate crime scene. Just a sunny day, a beach, and a decision that ended in tragedy and mystery. And because of that, because it could have happened to anyone's children, it changed the world. which brings us back to American soil, to a museum heist so audacious and so perfectly executed that it still baffles investigators over 30 years later. The Gardner Museum heist, 1990. St. Patrick's Day, 1990. Well, technically just past midnight, so early morning on March 18th, the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston. Two men dressed as police officers knocked on the side entrance. They told the security guards there'd been a report of a disturbance. The guards, both young and relatively inexperienced, let them in. That was their first mistake. It would also be their last as employees of the museum. Once inside, the fake police officers announced it was a robbery. They handcuffed the two guards and led them to the basement, where they duct taped them to pipes and covered their heads. For the next 81 minutes, those guards heard footsteps above them, the sound of frames being removed from walls, the casual efficiency of thieves who knew exactly what they were doing. When it was over, 13 works of art were gone. The estimated value? $500 million. What did they take? 3 Rembrandts, including his only seascape, The Storm on the Sea of Galilee. A Vermeer, The Concert, one of only 34 known paintings by the Dutch master. A Manet, 5 Degas drawings, a Chinese bronze beaker from the Shang dynasty, a finial from a Napoleonic flag. These weren't random selections. Whoever planned this heist knew art. They knew value. They knew what they wanted. But here's the strange part. They also left behind more valuable pieces. There were paintings in that museum worth more than some of the ones they took. The thieves walked right past them. They also took things that made no sense, like an ancient Chinese ge that was worth relatively little compared to the masterpieces. The pattern suggests either they had specific buyers lined up for certain pieces, or they were working from a list and didn't deviate, even when better opportunities presented themselves. The investigation began immediately. The FBI took the lead. They interviewed hundreds of people. They followed thousands of tips. They investigated everyone from local mob figures to international art theft rings. Over the years, certain names have surfaced as suspects. Some investigators believe it was the work of organized crime, that the artwork was stolen as collateral or bargaining chips. Others think it was a professional theft crew that had planned the job meticulously. But despite decades of investigation, despite all the resources thrown at this case, not a single piece of stolen art has been recovered. And the museum wants them back. The empty frames still hang on the walls where the paintings once were, a haunting reminder of what was lost. The museum offers a $10 million reward for information leading to the recovery of the art in good condition. It's one of the largest rewards ever offered for stolen property. And yet, nothing. No one has come forward with credible information. No one has tried to sell the pieces publicly. They've just vanished. Here's what makes art theft cases particularly difficult. You can't just sell a Rembrandt on the open market. These paintings are famous, cataloged, and instantly recognizable. Any legitimate auction house or gallery would report them immediately. So, stolen masterpieces typically enter a black market world of private collectors, people wealthy and unscrupulous enough to buy art they can never display publicly. Or the art becomes collateral in criminal enterprises, traded among criminals like very expensive currency. In 2013, the FBI announced they knew who had committed the heist. They believed the thieves were members of a criminal organization based in New England and the Mid-Atlantic. They believed the art had moved through the criminal underworld and might have even traveled to Philadelphia and Connecticut. But they also admitted the suspects were likely dead. And still the art remained missing. The Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum heist remains the largest unsolved art theft in history. 13 irreplaceable works, pieces of human cultural heritage, gone in 81 minutes and never seen again. Somewhere, maybe in a vault or a basement or a mansion, those paintings might still exist. Or maybe they were destroyed, burned, or damaged beyond recognition. We don't know. And speaking of people who disappeared under circumstances that still don't make sense, Let me tell you about a pilot and her navigator who vanished over the Pacific Ocean. Amelia Earhart, 1937, July 2nd, 1937, somewhere over the Pacific Ocean. Amelia Earhart and her navigator, Fred Noonan, were attempting something extraordinary to circumnavigate the globe at the equator. They'd already flown 22,000 miles. They were nearly done, just a few more legs of the journey. They took off from Lae, New Guinea, heading for Howland Island, a tiny coral atoll in the middle of the Pacific. It was supposed to be a routine flight, as routine as flying across an ocean can be. They never arrived. Amelia Earhart wasn't just any pilot. She was the most famous aviator in the world, male or female. She'd been the first woman to fly solo across the Atlantic. She'd set altitude records, speed records, distance records. She was a best-selling author, a fashion designer, a celebrity in an era when female celebrities were rare outside of Hollywood. She was a symbol of possibility, of what women could achieve if given the chance. And then she disappeared into the blue expanse of the Pacific, and the world has been looking for her ever since. The last confirmed radio contact came at 8:43 in the morning. Earhart reported they were flying at 1,000 feet and running low on fuel. She couldn't find Howland Island. The U.S. Coast Guard cutter Itasca was stationed near the island to provide radio navigation, but communications were spotty and unclear. Earhart's voice grew more urgent with each transmission. Then, silence. The U.S. Navy and Coast Guard launched an immediate search operation. It was massive, covering over 250,000 square miles of ocean. They searched for 17 days, deploying ships and aircraft, scanning the water for any sign of wreckage or survivors. They found nothing. Not a piece of debris, not a life raft, not a body. It was as if the Lockheed Electra and its two occupants had simply evaporated. Theories about what happened have multiplied over the decades. The simplest and most widely accepted is that they ran out of fuel, crashed into the Pacific, and sank. The ocean is deep in that region, thousands of feet down. A plane could sink and never be found, swallowed by the dark water and buried in sediment. It's a perfectly reasonable explanation. It's also deeply unsatisfying because it provides no closure, no evidence, no certainty. Other theories are more elaborate. One suggests they crash-landed on Gardner Island, now called Nikumaroro, an uninhabited atoll south of Howland. Some researchers have found artifacts there, pieces of metal and glass that could have come from an aircraft, personal items that might have belonged to Earhart or Noonan. Bones were found on the island in 1940 and dismissed as belonging to a man. Modern analysis suggests they might have been female, but nothing is definitive. Then there's the theory that they were captured by the Japanese military, that they'd strayed into Japanese-controlled waters and were taken prisoner, possibly executed as spies. Some witnesses in the Marshall Islands claim to have seen a white woman pilot brought ashore. Documents allegedly show Japanese awareness of their capture, but the evidence is circumstantial, the witnesses unreliable, and many historians dismiss this theory as unfounded. In 2024, a deep-sea exploration team claimed to have located wreckage that matched Earhart's plane 16,000 feet below the Pacific, not far from Howland Island. The announcement made headlines, but as of now, the wreckage hasn't been positively identified. It might be her plane. It might not be. We're still waiting for confirmation, for proof, for something concrete after 87 years of searching. What makes Amelia Earhart's disappearance so enduring isn't just the mystery of where she is, it's who she was. She represented courage, adventure, the breaking of boundaries. Her loss felt personal to the millions of people. And because we never found her, we never got closure. She's still out there somewhere, frozen in time. The Tamam Shud case, 1948, December 1st, 1948. Somerton Beach, Adelaide, Australia. Another Australian case, I know, but this one influenced American forensic investigation methods and remains one of the strangest unsolved mysteries ever recorded. A man was found dead, slumped against a seawall, dressed in a white shirt, tie, and brown suit. He looked like he'd simply sat down and never gotten back up. No identification, no wallet, no labels in his clothing. Nothing to indicate who he was or where he'd come from. The autopsy made things stranger. The man appeared to have been in excellent physical condition, perhaps an athlete or someone who maintained rigorous fitness, but he was dead, and the pathologist couldn't definitively determine why. There were signs consistent with poisoning, but no poison could be identified in his system with the testing available at the time. His stomach contents suggested his last meal had been a pasty, eaten 3 to 4 hours before death. That was it. That's all they could determine. Then investigators found something peculiar. Hidden in a tiny pocket sewn into the waistband of his trousers, a pocket so small it could have easily been missed, was a scrap of paper. On it were 2 words printed in an elegant script, Tamam Shud. The phrase is Persian from the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, a collection of poetry. It means ended or finished, and it appears on the last page of the book. Someone had carefully torn those exact words from a copy of the Rubaiyat and hidden them in a secret pocket. Police launched a public appeal. Did anyone have a copy of the Rubaiyat with the last page torn out? Weeks later, a man came forward. He'd found a copy of the book tossed into his unlocked car parked near Somerton Beach around the time of the death. The last page was missing, torn out exactly where Tamam Shud would have been printed. But that wasn't all. On the back cover of the book, someone had written a phone number and 5 lines of what appeared to be code. Letters grouped in seemingly random order. No obvious pattern, no clear meaning. The phone number belonged to a woman, a nurse living in Adelaide. Police questioned her. She looked at a cast of the dead man's face and said she didn't recognize him. But witnesses said she seemed upset, shaken, like she was hiding something. She refused to elaborate. The case file notes her reaction, but contains no explanation. To this day, we don't know what she knew or why the dead man had her phone number. The code has never been cracked. Cryptographers, amateur and professional, have tried for decades. Some believe it's a simple substitution cipher. Others think it might be a one-time pad, essentially unbreakable without the key. Some wonder if it's not a code at all, just random letters meant to look meaningful. The 5 lines sit there in the case file, mocking every attempt to decode them. For over 70 years, the Somerton man, as he became known, remained unidentified. His body was exhumed in 1949, so plaster casts could be made of his head and hands, then buried again. The casts were displayed publicly, hoping someone would recognize him. No one did. His fingerprints were checked against every database available. No match. Dental records led nowhere. He was a ghost, a man who existed but left no trace. Then, in 2022, something remarkable happened. Advances in DNA technology and genealogical databases finally provided an answer. Researchers extracted DNA from the man's hair and used genetic genealogy, the same technique that caught the Golden State Killer. They traced his family tree through distant relatives, and they found him. His name was Carl Charles Webb, an electrical engineer from Melbourne. He'd been born in 1905, had lived a relatively ordinary life, and for a reason still unknown, ended up dead on a beach in Adelaide with a torn scrap of Persian poetry in his pocket. But here's the thing. Knowing his name didn't solve the mystery. It just gave us more questions. Why did he have that code? Why was the nurse's phone number in his book? How did he die? Why was he in Adelaide? What was he running from or looking for? Carl Webb's identity was discovered, but the circumstances of his death remain as mysterious as they were in 1948. And speaking of mysterious deaths that make absolutely no sense, let me tell you about a serial killer who claimed to be a demon and had an entire city playing jazz music. The Axeman of New Orleans, 1918 to 1919. New Orleans, 1918. The city was already dealing with enough. World War I was raging. The Spanish flu pandemic was killing people by the thousands. And then someone or something started breaking into homes and attacking people with axes. Not just any axes. The victims' own axes, taken from their sheds and used against them. The Axeman of New Orleans had arrived. True. And he was about to become one of America's strangest and most terrifying unsolved cases. The attacks followed a pattern, which made them even more disturbing. The Axeman didn't break down doors or smash windows. He cut panels out of back doors, creating just enough space to reach through and unlock them from the inside. It was methodical, quiet, calculated. Then he'd find an axe, usually the homeowner's own tool, and use it. At least 12 people were attacked between May of 1918 and October of 1919. 6 died. The others survived but could provide little useful information. The attacks happened at night. The victims were often asleep. By the time they realized what was happening, the Axeman was already gone. Most of the victims were Italian or of Italian descent, specifically grocers and their families. This led to theories about the attacks being related to organized crime or black hand extortion, a form of criminal intimidation common in Italian immigrant communities. But there were problems with that theory. The Axeman didn't steal anything. He didn't leave demands. He didn't follow the typical patterns of mob violence. He just attacked and vanished. Then in March of 1919, something truly bizarre happened. A letter arrived at newspapers claiming to be from the Axeman himself. It's one of the strangest documents in American criminal history. The letter claimed he was not human, but a demon, a fell spirit from the hottest hell. He wrote in theatrical, almost gleeful language about his love of jazz music and his disdain for other types of music, and then he made a promise. On the night of March 19th, he would visit New Orleans again, but he would spare any home where a jazz band was playing. You have to understand how insane this was. A serial killer, or someone claiming to be the serial killer, was essentially holding the city hostage unless they threw a citywide jazz party. And here's the remarkable part. New Orleans complied. On the night of March 19th, 1919, the entire city played jazz. Dance halls were packed. People hired musicians to play in their homes. Bars and clubs stayed open late with live bands. The city turned into one massive jazz festival, all because of a letter that may or may not have been from an actual killer. And it worked. Sort of. There were no Axeman attacks that night. Whether that was because the letter was genuine and the killer kept his word, or because the whole thing was an elaborate hoax, or simply because the killer happened not to attack that night anyway, we'll never know. But the city took it seriously, and for one night, fear was drowned out by music. The attacks did continue after that, though less frequently. The last confirmed Axeman attack was in October of 1919. A man was attacked in his home and survived. He described his attacker as a large, heavy-set man. That was it. That was the most detailed description anyone ever provided. After October, the attacks stopped completely. The Axeman disappeared as mysteriously as he'd arrived. Over the years, there have been suspects. One man was killed by the widow of an Axeman victim who claimed he was the killer. But the attacks had already stopped by then, Chase, and there was no evidence linking him to the earlier crimes. Some historians believe the Axeman might have been multiple people, copycat killers taking advantage of the panic. Others think he was a single individual who either died, was arrested for something else, or simply stopped. The case remains unsolved. The Axeman of New Orleans was never identified, never caught, never brought to justice. All that remains are the newspaper accounts, the police reports, and that one incredible letter demanding jazz music. It's a case that feels more like fiction than fact, but it happened. Real people were attacked, real families were terrorized, and somewhere in the chaos and music of 1919, New Orleans, a killer walked free. So, which brings us to another case where the strangest details make you wonder if reality is sometimes weirder than any fiction we could invent. The Lead Masks of Vintham Hill, 1966, August 20th, 1966. Vintham Hill, Niterói, Brazil. Now, before you say this isn't an American case, let me stop you. This mystery was covered extensively in American media and became a cultural touchstone for UFO enthusiasts and conspiracy theorists across the United States. It influenced how Americans thought about unexplained deaths and strange circumstances. Plus, the sheer weirdness demands attention regardless of where it happened. Two young men were found dead on a hill. Miguel Jose Viana and Manuel Pereira da Cruz were both electronic technicians from Campos dos Goitacazes. They were lying side by side, dressed in formal suits, complete with ties, as if they'd been attending a business meeting or formal event. But they weren't at an event. They were on a remote hillside, and they were wearing crude masks made of lead, covering their eyes. Next to the bodies, investigators found an empty water bottle, two wet towels, and a small notebook. The notebook contained instructions, written in Portuguese, that read like something from a spy novel or a science fiction story. The notes described purchasing certain capsules, waiting until a specific time, ingesting the capsules, and then waiting for a signal while protecting their faces with the lead masks. That was it. Cryptic, bizarre, and utterly baffling. The autopsy couldn't determine a cause of death. There were no signs of violence, no obvious trauma, no clear indication of what had killed them. Toxicology testing was limited in 1966, especially in Brazil, and no poison was definitively identified. The best guess was that they'd ingested something, possibly the capsules mentioned in the notebook, but what those capsules contained remained unknown. Investigators tried to reconstruct their last day. Viana and Cruz had left their homes in Campos dos Goitacazes on August 17th. They took a bus to Niterói, bought the lead masks and the waterproof coats they were found wearing from a local shop. Witnesses remembered them because buying lead was unusual. They seemed calm, purposeful, not distressed or coerced. They bought the water bottle, went up the hill, and apparently followed the instructions in the notebook. Then they died. Theories exploded. Some believed it was a suicide pact related to a religious or spiritual belief. Others thought they were attempting some kind of ritual to contact extraterrestrial beings, with the lead masks meant to protect their eyes from bright lights or radiation. There were whispers of secret experiments, of government involvement, of drugs that could induce visions or altered states. None of these theories could be proven. The UFO angle gained traction because of witness reports. Several people claimed to have seen strange lights in the sky above Vintham Hill around the time of the deaths. Descriptions varied. Some said orange lights, others said a glowing object. Others described something hovering. Were these accounts reliable? Were people seeing aircraft, weather phenomena, or were they influenced by the strange circumstances and eager to contribute to the mystery? We don't know. What we do know is that Viana and Cruz were real people with families, jobs, and lives. They were described as intelligent, responsible men. They weren't known to be involved in cults or fringe groups. They had no apparent reason to climb a hill and die under such bizarre circumstances, and yet they did. The case remains unsolved. Brazilian authorities closed it without reaching a definitive conclusion. The lead masks are preserved in evidence. The notebook still exists, but no one has ever explained what those men were trying to do, what signal they were waiting for, or why they believed lead masks would protect them. It's a mystery that crosses borders and cultures, a reminder that sometimes human behavior defies all attempts at rational explanation. And speaking of behavior that makes absolutely no sense, let me tell you about three lighthouse keepers who vanished from a remote island in a way that still haunts maritime historians. The Flannan Isles Lighthouse Keepers, 1900, December 15th, 1900, or possibly earlier. That's part of the mystery. The Flannan Isles, a remote cluster of rocks in the Atlantic Ocean off the coast of Scotland. There sat a lighthouse, operational for less than a year, staffed by three experienced keepers, James Ducat, Thomas Marshall, and Donald MacArthur. When a relief vessel arrived on December 26th to rotate crew, all three men were gone. The ship's captain noticed something wrong immediately. No flag was flying. No supplies were waiting at the landing. No one responded to signals. When crew members went ashore, they found the lighthouse empty but otherwise functional. The lamp was out. The clock had stopped. The beds were unmade. Two sets of outdoor weather gear were missing from their hooks. The third set was still there, hanging neatly. In the kitchen, the table was set for a meal that had never been eaten. A chair was knocked over, unusual for keepers known for their discipline and order. The logbook provided some clues, but raised more questions. The entries described a severe storm on December 12th through December 14th. But here's the thing. No other station in the area reported a storm during those days. The weather had been calm. The final entry was dated December 15th. It noted the storm had ended and everything was calm. So, Marshall, one of the keepers, had apparently written that Ducat, the principal keeper, had been very quiet. MacArthur, the third keeper, was described as crying. This was completely out of character for these men, all seasoned lighthouse keepers with years of experience. And then the entries stopped. The physical evidence at the scene was contradictory. Damage to equipment and railings suggested violent waves had struck the island. A storage box 70 feet above sea level had been destroyed. Ropes and supplies had been scattered. Something powerful had hit the island. But when? And why were the keepers outside during a storm severe enough to damage equipment that high up? The official investigation concluded that the men had gone out to secure equipment during an unexpected storm and been swept away by a massive wave. Two were in their weather gear. The third, presumably in a rush, went out without his. All three were lost. It was a logical explanation, the kind that explains maritime accidents all the time. Except it doesn't explain the logbook entries about a storm that apparently didn't happen, or why experienced keepers would all go outside during dangerous conditions. Alternative theories emerged. Some suggested a rogue wave, larger than anything recorded, had struck without warning. Others wondered if there'd been an argument, if violence had occurred. Supernatural explanations crept in too. Stories of sea monsters or ghostly ships. The poet Wilfred Wilson Gibson wrote The Flannan Isle in 1912, cementing the mystery in popular culture with lines about the keeper's unexplained absence. What makes this case so unsettling is the ordinariness disrupted. These weren't adventurers or risk takers. They were professional lighthouse keepers doing a job they'd done for years. The lighthouse was designed to be safe, the routine established and predictable. And yet 3 men vanished so completely that not a single body was ever recovered. The Atlantic kept them, and the truth with them. The Flannan Isles Lighthouse continued operation with new keepers, Though many reportedly requested transfers, it was automated in 1971. Today, it stands empty, maintained remotely, a memorial to three men who walked out into the weather and never came back. And speaking of cases where children vanished and left families searching for decades, let me tell you about one that's haunted America for nearly 30 years. John Benet Ramsey, 1996, December 26th, 1996. Boulder, Colorado, the day after Christmas. Patsy Ramsey came downstairs early and found a ransom note on the staircase. It was long, almost 3 pages, written on paper from a notepad in the house. The note demanded $118,000, roughly the amount of John Ramsey's recent bonus, for the safe return of their 6-year-old daughter, John Benet. Patsy screamed for her husband. They checked John Benet's room. She was gone. Police arrived within minutes. The house was searched, though not as thoroughly as it should have been. Friends and family were called and came over, contaminating what should have been a crime scene. Everyone was focused on the ransom note, on preparing for a call from the kidnappers, on getting John Benet back safely. Hours passed. No call came, no ransom demand, nothing. That afternoon, Detective Linda Arndt suggested John Ramsey and a family friend search the house again, top to bottom. They went to the basement. In a small storage room, a room that had reportedly been checked earlier, John Ramsey found his daughter. She was deceased. Her hands were tied above her head with cord. There was duct tape over her mouth. She'd been struck on the head and also showed signs of strangulation. The family's worst nightmare had been in the basement the entire time. What followed was one of the most investigated, most publicized, and most controversial criminal cases in American history. The Boulder Police Department took the lead. The FBI got involved. Multiple grand juries were convened. Thousands of tips poured in. Hundreds of people were investigated. And despite all that effort, despite all the resources and attention, no one has ever been charged. The case became a media sensation. John Benet had competed in child beauty pageants. There were photographs and videos of her performing, images that were replayed endlessly on television. The public became obsessed with the case, with theories about who could have done this and why. The Ramsey family, particularly Patsy and John, faced intense scrutiny and suspicion, though they maintained their innocence and were never charged. The ransom note became a focal point. It was unusual in almost every way. Most ransom notes are brief. This one was nearly 3 pages, rambling and oddly specific. It referenced movies, made threats, and included details that seemed designed to mislead investigators. Handwriting analysis was inconclusive. Some experts said Patsy Ramsey could have written it. Others disagreed. The notepad and pen used came from the house, suggesting the note was written there, not brought by an intruder. DNA evidence added another layer of complexity. Unknown male DNA was found on John Benet's clothing and under her fingernails. It didn't match anyone in the family. It didn't match anyone in the DNA databases. In 2008, advances in DNA testing led the Boulder District Attorney to officially clear the Ramsey family, stating the DNA evidence pointed to an intruder. But many investigators disagreed with that conclusion. The case remained divisive. Theories have proliferated. Some believe an intruder entered the house through a basement window, though evidence of forced entry was questionable. Others focus on people who had access to the house or knowledge of the family. Some point to the unusual aspects of the crime scene and suggest the staging of evidence. Every theory has supporters and detractors. Every piece of evidence can be interpreted multiple ways. Patsy Ramsey died in 2006 from ovarian cancer, never knowing who killed her daughter. John Ramsey has continued to advocate for further DNA testing and investigation. John Bonet's brother Burke, who was 9 years old at the time and was home that night, has also maintained his innocence and cooperated with investigators. The case remains open. Boulder police continue to accept tips and follow leads, but nearly 30 years later, John Benet Ramsey's death remains unsolved, a tragedy that captivated the nation and still haunts everyone who remembers it. The Hinterkaifeck murders, 1922, March 31st, 1922. A remote farmstead called Hinterkaifeck, about 40 miles north of Munich, Germany. Now I know what you're thinking. Germany, not America. But this case became a cultural phenomenon in the United States during the true crime podcast era, and it influenced how American investigators think about rural crime scenes and unsolved family murders. Plus, it's so deeply strange that it deserves to be part of any conversation about mysterious deaths. The farmstead was isolated, the kind of place where your nearest neighbor was far enough away that screaming wouldn't help. 6 people lived there: Andreas Gruber, the patriarch, his wife Kazilia, their widowed daughter Victoria, and Victoria's 2 children, Kazilia and Joseph. The family's maid also lived on the property. That made 6 people total. On the night of March 31st, all 6 were killed with a mattock, a farming tool similar to a pickaxe. But here's where it gets truly unsettling. Days before the murders, Andreas Gruber had noticed strange things. Footprints in the snow leading from the forest to the farm, but no footprints leading back. He'd heard footsteps in the attic. A newspaper had appeared on the property that no one had ordered. Keys had gone missing. He'd mentioned these oddities to neighbors, but he hadn't called the police. Maybe he thought it was nothing. Maybe he was used to rural isolation, making every sound seem suspicious. Either way, he didn't report it. The previous maid had quit 6 months earlier. She'd claimed the house was haunted. She'd heard sounds, felt presences, experienced things she couldn't explain. Chody, the family had hired a new maid, Maria Baumgartner, who arrived on March 31st, the day of the murders. By evening, she was dead along with the rest of the household. The bodies weren't discovered until April 4th, 4 days later. Neighbors noticed no one had been seen. The children hadn't shown up for school. Mail was piling up. When people finally went to check, they found a scene that horrified even experienced investigators. 4 of the victims had been lured to the barn and killed there. The 2 youngest, Victoria's children, were killed in their beds in the house. The violence was brutal and methodical. But the truly disturbing detail came from the crime scene investigation. Evidence suggested the killer or killers had stayed at the farm for several days after the murders. Someone had fed the livestock. The cattle had been milked, the chickens fed, the dogs cared for. Neighbors had even seen smoke coming from the chimney. Food had been eaten in the kitchen. Someone had been living there, walking through rooms where bodies lay just meters away, going about farm chores as if nothing had happened. The investigation was extensive. Over 100 people were questioned. Theories ranged from robbery gone wrong to family disputes to revenge killings. Some suspected Victoria's husband, Carl Gabriel, who had been declared dead in World War I, but whose body was never found. Maybe he'd returned and killed the family in some kind of deranged rage. But there was no evidence, no sightings, nothing to support it. Others pointed to the odd financial situation. Andreas Gruber had money, more than a simple farmer should have. Some thought he was involved in something illegal, that the murders were related to criminal enterprises, but again, no proof emerged. Another theory focused on Victoria's relationship with a local man, suggesting jealousy or passion as a motive. Every theory had holes. The case went cold. The farm was eventually torn down in the 1920s. The site is now just empty land, though a memorial marks where Hinterkaifeck once stood. The murders remain Germany's most famous unsolved crime, a mystery that's endured for over a century. What makes Hinterkaifeck so haunting isn't just the violence, it's the calculated strangeness. Someone killed 6 people, then stayed in the house, performed farm chores, lived among the bodies for days before disappearing. It suggests a level of detachment and control that's genuinely chilling. And despite all the investigation, all the theories, all the public interest, no one was ever charged. The killer simply walked away into history. And speaking of people who walked away and were never seen again, let me tell you about 3 women who vanished from their home on a summer night in Missouri. The Springfield Three, 1992, June 7th, 1992, Springfield, Missouri. 3 women vanished from a house in the middle of the night, leaving behind their purses, their cars, their shoes, everything. Just gone. No signs of struggle, no obvious clues, no witnesses. It's been over 30 years, and no one knows what happened to them. Here's how it started. Cheryl Levitt, 47, lived with her daughter, Suzanne Streeter, 19. On the night of June 6th, Suzanne and her friend, Stacy McCall, 18, had attended graduation parties. They'd originally planned to stay somewhere else, but changed their minds and decided to spend the night at Cheryl's house. They arrived sometime after 2 in the morning. By noon the next day, when friends came looking for them, all 3 women were gone. The friends who discovered the disappearance made some critical mistakes. This was 1992, before widespread awareness of crime scene preservation. They went into the house calling for the women. They listened to messages on the answering machine, erasing them in the process. One message was reportedly strange, a man's voice making lewd comments, but it was deleted before police could hear it. They cleaned up broken glass from the porch light's globe. They moved things, touched things, contaminated potential evidence with the best intentions, but the worst possible timing. When police finally arrived and processed the scene, they found almost nothing useful. The women's cars were parked outside. Their purses were lined up neatly in the house, contents undisturbed. The beds appeared to have been slept in. There was no sign of forced entry, no obvious signs of struggle. The only odd detail was the broken porch light. The globe had been shattered and swept into a neat pile, suggesting someone had cleaned it up. But who? And when? The investigation expanded quickly. Police interviewed hundreds of people. They looked at everyone who knew the women, everyone who'd been at the graduation parties, everyone who had any connection, however remote. Multiple suspects emerged over the years. Some were cleared. So, others remained persons of interest, but could never be definitively linked to the disappearances. One suspect was a man who'd been harassing Cheryl Levitt, making unwanted advances and inappropriate comments. He had a criminal history and no solid alibi. But there was no physical evidence connecting him to the house that night. Another suspect was a convicted grave robber who'd been active in the area. He failed a polygraph test about the case and made suspicious statements, but again, no physical evidence. A third suspect was identified years later through witness statements, but by then memories had faded and evidence had degraded. The case generated numerous tips and theories. Some believed it was a case of wrong house, that the intended targets lived elsewhere and the perpetrator made a mistake. Others thought it was specifically targeted at one of the women. There were theories about trafficking, about revenge, about random violence. None could be proven. One particularly persistent rumor involves a parking garage. Shortly after the disappearances, concrete was poured for the foundation of a new hospital parking garage near the women's last known location. Some psychics and amateur investigators became convinced the bodies were buried beneath that concrete. Ground penetrating radar has been used to scan the area multiple times. Results have been inconclusive and controversial. The hospital has resisted excavation due to cost and structural concerns. Cheryl Levitt's mother, Janice McCall's parents, and Suzanne Streeter's father have all passed away without knowing what happened to their loved ones. The case remains open with the Springfield Police Department. Investigators still follow leads when they emerge. In recent years, familial DNA and genetic genealogy have offered new hope, but so far, no breakthrough has occurred. The Springfield 3 case is particularly frustrating because of its ordinariness. These weren't people involved in dangerous activities or risky lifestyles. They were a mother, a daughter, and a friend who came home after graduation parties. They locked the door, went to bed, and vanished. No dramatic confrontation, no obvious motive, just 3 people erased from existence in the middle of an ordinary night. And speaking of people who seem to vanish without explanation, let me tell you about a boy whose identity remained unknown for 65 years. The Boy in the Box, 1957. February 25th, 1957. A wooded area in Fox Chase, Philadelphia. A young man was checking muskrat traps when he spotted a cardboard box, the kind that would hold a baby bassinet. He didn't open it right then, but he came back later out of curiosity and looked inside. What he found was a child's body, and it would become one of America's most haunting, unidentified person cases. The boy was somewhere between 4 and 6 years old. He'd been wrapped in a plaid blanket and placed carefully in the box. His body had been recently bathed. His hair appeared to have been cut shortly before his death, maybe even after. His fingernails were trimmed. Someone had taken care with his appearance, which made the circumstances even more disturbing. He'd suffered trauma and showed signs of long-term mistreatment, but in his final moments, someone had cleaned him, groomed him, wrapped him. Police launched an intensive investigation. They distributed flyers with the boy's photograph to every household in Philadelphia. They checked missing children reports from across the country. They interviewed thousands of people. No one recognized him. No one reported him missing. It was as if he'd never existed, never been to school, never seen a doctor, never been part of any official record. The boy's fingerprints were sent to the FBI. No match. His description was circulated nationally. Nothing. Investigators tried to trace the blanket and the box. The blanket was a common type sold in many stores. The box had been manufactured by a company that made bassinets, but thousands had been sold. Neither provided useful leads. Over the decades, the case remained active in the minds of investigators and the public. The boy was buried in a potter's field, but a donated headstone marked his grave with the words, "Heavenly Father, bless this unknown boy." People left toys and flowers. He became a symbol of all the forgotten children, the ones who slip through society's cracks and leave no trace. Tips came in periodically. In 2002, a woman came forward claiming the boy was a child who'd been purchased by her abusive mother. She described specific details about the house, about the abuse, about how the boy had died and been disposed of. Investigators checked the location she described. The house matched her description. The blanket matched. But there was no physical evidence, no way to verify her story. The case file noted her testimony but couldn't confirm it. Our DNA testing offered new hope. In the early 2000s, investigators exhumed the boy's remains and extracted DNA. They ran it through databases, checked it against missing children, looked for familial matches. Nothing came up. The technology improved over the years. Genetic genealogy became a tool. Researchers started building family trees from distant DNA relatives, the same technique that had solved other cold cases. Finally, in December of 2022, 65 years after the boy's body was found, investigators announced they'd identified him. His name was Joseph Augustus Zarelli. He'd been born in January of 1953. He was 4 years old when he died. His parents were identified through DNA genealogy. Birth records confirmed his existence, but knowing his name didn't solve the case. The announcement of his identity brought some closure. He was no longer just the boy in the box. He was Joseph. He had a name, a birthday, a place in history, but the circumstances of his death remained unclear. Who had custody of him? How did he end up in that box? Who cleaned him and wrapped him and left him in the woods? Those questions persist. The investigation continues. Philadelphia police are still working to determine what happened to Joseph Augustus Zarelli, to find who was responsible, to bring some measure of justice. After 65 years of being unknown, he at least has his identity. But the mystery of his death remains unsolved. And speaking of mysteries that haunted investigators for decades before finally being resolved, let me tell you about 9 hikers who died in circumstances so bizarre that people are still arguing about what happened. The Dyatlov Pass Incident, 1959, February 2nd, 1959, the Ural Mountains in the Soviet Union. 9 experienced hikers, all students or graduates of the Ural Polytechnic Institute, were on a skiing expedition. They never came back. When search teams found them weeks later, the scene was so disturbing and inexplicable that it spawned decades of theories, investigations, and genuine confusion about what could cause such deaths. The group was led by Igor Dyatlov, a 23-year-old engineering student. The hikers were well-equipped, experienced, and prepared for the harsh winter conditions. They'd set up camp on the slopes of Kolatsyakhl, a mountain whose name translates to Dead Mountain in the local Mansi language. Not the most encouraging name, but they were experienced. They knew what they were doing, except something went catastrophically wrong. When they didn't return as scheduled, search teams were sent out. On February 26th, they found the tent. It had been cut open from the inside. Not carefully opened, but slashed, as if the occupants had been desperate to get out quickly. The tent was partially collapsed under snow, but still contained most of the group's belongings. Their boots were there, their warm clothing was there. The hikers had fled into negative 30-degree Fahrenheit temperatures, wearing minimal clothing. Footprints led away from the tent down the slope. The searchers followed them and began finding bodies. The first 2 were found near the tree line, under a large cedar tree. They were barefoot, wearing only underwear. Branches on the cedar had been broken, suggesting someone had climbed it, maybe trying to see something or get away from something. A fire had been made at the base. The 2 men had died from hypothermia. 3 more bodies, including Dyatlov's, were found between the cedar and the tent. They appeared to have been trying to return to camp but succumbed to the cold. Hypothermia made sense for these 5. They'd fled the tent inadequately dressed and couldn't survive the temperature. But why had they fled? The remaining 4 hikers weren't found until May when the snow melted. They were in a ravine, buried under several meters of snow. And this is where the case becomes truly disturbing. These 4 had injuries that didn't match simple hypothermia deaths. One had major chest trauma consistent with severe blunt force, like being hit by a car. Another had similar rib fractures. One was missing her tongue and eyes. The injuries were catastrophic, the kind you'd see in serious accidents, but there was no external trauma. No bruises, no cuts, no signs they'd been in a fight. The Soviet investigation concluded the deaths were caused by an unknown compelling force. Not exactly helpful. Investigators ruled out other people being involved. There were no signs of a struggle or attack. The area was too remote for anyone else to be there. So what happened? Theories multiplied. Some thought an avalanche had struck the tent, causing panic. The hikers fled, became separated, and died from cold and injuries sustained in the snowslide. Recent studies using modern avalanche science suggest a small slab avalanche could have hit the tent, creating enough panic to make experienced hikers cut their way out and run. The injuries to the four in the ravine could have come from a secondary snow collapse. Other theories were more exotic. Some pointed to military testing in the area. Maybe the hikers encountered a weapons test, parachute mines, or toxic chemicals. Maybe they were ordered to leave by military personnel and died as a result. There were reports of strange lights in the sky that night, leading to speculation about everything from rocket tests to extraterrestrial involvement. The case remained officially closed but culturally alive. Books, documentaries, and investigations continued for decades. In 2019, Russian authorities reopened the case. In 2020, they concluded that a small avalanche was the most likely explanation. The hikers, in a panic and possibly suffering from hypothermia-induced confusion, made poor decisions that led to their deaths. But debates continue. Some experts accept the avalanche theory. Others find it inadequate to explain all the evidence. The Dyatlov Pass incident remains one of those cases where the facts are known but the interpretations disputed. 9 people died in the mountains, and exactly why may never be fully understood. The disappearance of Flight 19, 1945, December 5th, 1945, Fort Lauderdale, Florida. 5 U.S. Navy torpedo bombers designated Flight 19 took off on a routine training mission over the Atlantic. 14 airmen, experienced pilots, clear weather, a standard navigation exercise. By evening, all 5 planes had vanished. Then the plane sent to rescue them also disappeared with 13 crew. 6 aircraft, 27 men. Gone. And the mystery helped create one of the most enduring legends in American culture, the Bermuda Triangle. Flight 19 was led by Lieutenant Charles Taylor, an experienced pilot with over 2,500 flight hours. The mission was simple: fly east from Fort Lauderdale, practice bombing runs, then navigate back. Student pilots were flying the other 4 planes, but they had Taylor as their leader. Everything should have been routine. But around 3:30 in the afternoon, radio transmissions from Flight 19 indicated something was wrong. Taylor reported that both his compasses had failed. He wasn't sure of their position. Other pilots in the flight were heard asking Taylor for directions. The transmissions became increasingly confused. Taylor seemed to believe they were over the Florida Keys when they were actually over the Bahamas. Instead of flying west toward land, they flew further east, out over the Atlantic. Ground control tried to guide them back, but radio communication was poor. Transmissions were garbled, overlapping, difficult to understand. Taylor's confusion seemed to spread to the other pilots. As daylight faded and fuel ran low, the situation became desperate. The last transmission from Flight 19 was received around 7:04 in the evening. Then silence. A search operation began immediately. A Martin Mariner flying boat, essentially a large rescue plane, took off from Banana River Naval Air Station with a crew of 13. 23 minutes after takeoff, the Mariner disappeared. A ship in the area reported seeing an explosion and fireball in the sky at the approximate time and location. The Mariner likely exploded in flight, possibly due to fuel vapor ignition. The planes were known to have this risk, but wreckage was never found. The search for Flight 19 continued for days. The Navy deployed dozens of aircraft and ships, covering over 250,000 square miles of ocean and coastline. They found nothing. No wreckage, no life rafts, no debris. The Atlantic had swallowed 6 aircraft and 27 men without leaving a trace. The official Navy investigation concluded that the disappearance was caused by Taylor's confusion and navigational errors. He'd gotten lost, led the flight out over open ocean, and they ran out of fuel and crashed into the sea. The ocean in that area is deep, with strong currents. Wreckage could sink quickly and be scattered or buried. The explanation made sense, but the lack of any physical evidence frustrated investigators and fascinated the public. In the following decades, Flight 19 became the centerpiece of Bermuda Triangle mythology. Writers pointed to it as evidence of mysterious forces in that region of the Atlantic. Books and television shows suggested everything from magnetic anomalies to alien abduction to interdimensional portals. The reality is almost certainly more mundane: navigational error, mechanical failure, bad luck, and the unforgiving nature of the ocean combine to create a tragedy. But the human mind struggles with randomness. We want patterns, explanations, reasons. A mechanical failure and pilot error doesn't feel adequate to explain such a complete disappearance. So the mystery endures, fed by our need for something more than bad luck and deep water. The Tylenol Murders, 1982. September 29th, 1982. Chicago area. A 12-year-old girl named Mary Kellerman woke up with a cold. Her parents gave her extra strength Tylenol. Within hours, she collapsed and died. That same day, Adam Janus, a postal worker, took Tylenol for chest pain. He died. His brother and sister-in-law took pills from the same bottle at his house later that day. They both died. By October 1st, 7 people were dead, and investigators had figured out the horrifying connection. Someone had poisoned Tylenol capsules. The scale of the panic was immediate and massive. Johnson & Johnson, the company that made Tylenol, issued warnings. Stores pulled Tylenol from shelves nationwide. Police went door to door telling people to throw away any Tylenol in their homes. Hospitals were flooded with people worried they'd been poisoned. The entire nation was terrified of their own medicine cabinets. Investigators determined that someone had purchased bottles of extra-strength Tylenol capsules from stores in the Chicago area, opened them, laced the capsules with potassium cyanide, and returned the bottles to store shelves. The cyanide doses were massive, thousands of times the lethal amount. Death came within minutes of ingestion. There was no way to know which bottles were poisoned until someone took a pill and died. The randomness was what made it so terrifying. These weren't targeted killings. The victims had nothing in common. They didn't know each other. They just happened to buy poison bottles from different stores. The killer had created a deadly lottery where purchasing common pain medication could mean death. Johnson & Johnson's response became a model for corporate crisis management. They recalled 31 million bottles of Tylenol, worth over $100 million. They stopped all production and advertising. They created new tamper-resistant packaging with safety seals. They cooperated fully with investigators. The company took a massive financial hit, but prioritized public safety, and eventually, that decision restored consumer trust. The investigation became one of the FBI's largest and longest. Thousands of people were interviewed. Every Tylenol factory was inspected. Every distribution center was investigated. Hundreds of suspects were considered. The problem was motive. This wasn't robbery. The killer didn't demand ransom. No one claimed responsibility. No political or ideological statement was made. It appeared to be random violence for its own sake, which made finding the perpetrator incredibly difficult. One suspect emerged as a primary focus: James William Lewis. He'd sent a letter to Johnson & Johnson demanding $1 million to stop the killings. The letter was traced back to him. He was arrested, but not for murder. He was charged with extortion. Investigators searched his home and questioned him extensively, but they couldn't connect him to the actual poisonings. He served 13 years for extortion and was released. He maintained he didn't poison the Tylenol, that he'd only tried to extort the company after hearing about the murders. Without physical evidence linking him to the poisoned bottles, prosecutors couldn't charge him with the deaths. Other suspects were investigated over the years. Theories included disgruntled employees, anti corporate terrorists, and mentally unstable individuals. None panned out. The case generated over 12,000 tips. Every lead was followed. Nothing definitive emerged. In 2011, the FBI returned to James Lewis, searching his home again with new forensic technology. Again, nothing conclusive was found. The Tylenol murders changed America in lasting ways. Tamper-evident packaging became standard for over-the-counter medications and food products. You know those plastic seals on bottles, the foil under caps, the shrink wrap around boxes? Those exist because of this case. Federal anti-tampering laws were passed in 1983, making product tampering a federal crime. The way we think about product safety, the way companies respond to contamination scares, the entire infrastructure of consumer protection was reshaped by 7 deaths in Chicago in 1982. But justice was never served. The person who laced those Tylenol capsules with cyanide was never identified, never caught, never punished. 7 families never got closure. The case remains open, though realistically, after 40 years, the chances of solving it diminish with each passing year. Somewhere, someone knows what happened, and they've kept that secret for decades. And speaking of secrets kept for decades, let me tell you about a series of child murders that terrorized a Michigan community and remain unsolved nearly 50 years later. The Oakland County child killer, 1976 to 1977, February 15, 1976. Oakland County, Michigan. 12-year-old Mark Stebbins left his mother's home in Ferndale to walk to a nearby American Legion Hall. He never came home. 4 days later, his body was found in a parking lot in Southfield. He'd been held captive for those 4 days, then killed, and his body carefully placed in a public location. It was the beginning of a nightmare that would claim 4 young lives and haunt a community for decades. Mark's death was investigated, but without strong leads, the case went cold. Then, in December of 1976, 12-year-old Jill Robinson disappeared from Royal Oak. She'd argued with her mother and left home. 4 days later, her body was found along the side of a road. Like Mark, she'd been held captive for days before being killed. Her body had been washed and groomed. She was wearing clean clothes. The killer had taken care with her appearance, a detail that was both bizarre and deeply disturbing. Less than a month later, 10-year-old Christine Mihelish vanished while walking home from a store in Berkeley. 19 days later, her body was found in a snowbank in Franklin Village. Again, she'd been held captive, cared for in some twisted way, then killed. Her body showed no signs of neglect during captivity. She'd been fed, cleaned, kept in reasonable condition before her death. The pattern was becoming clear and terrifying. The final victim was 11-year-old Timothy King. On March 16th, 1977, he left home to buy candy at a nearby pharmacy in Birmingham. Witnesses saw him at the store, then he vanished. 6 days later, his body was found in a ditch in Livonia. Like the others, he'd been held, cared for, and killed. His clothes were clean. He'd been fed his favorite meal, fried chicken, shortly before death. The killer knew details about him, suggesting surveillance or research. The similarities between the cases were unmistakable. All 4 children were from Oakland County. All were held for multiple days before being killed. All were washed, groomed, and placed in visible locations, sometimes across township lines. The killer wanted the bodies found, but also wanted to demonstrate control, to show that these children had been in their care and had been treated with a disturbing form of attention before death. The investigation became enormous. A task force was formed. Thousands of tips poured in. Police interviewed hundreds of suspects. Composite sketches were created based on witness accounts of suspicious individuals near the abduction sites. A man with a vehicle had been seen near where Timothy King disappeared. Someone driving a blue AMC Gremlin had been spotted near other scenes, but leads fizzled. Suspects were cleared. The case grew cold. One suspect who emerged years later was Christopher Bush, a convicted predator who'd been in the area during the murders. He died by apparent self-inflicted means in 1978, shortly after the last murder. Some investigators believed he was the Oakland County child killer. Evidence found at his home included materials suggesting he'd had contact with victims, but the connection was never definitively proven, and some investigators disagreed with this theory. Another suspect was a man involved in a child exploitation ring operating in the area during the same period. Multiple people connected to this ring were investigated. Some went to prison for other crimes, but none was ever charged with the Oakland County murders. The ring's existence suggested a network of offenders, raising the possibility that multiple people might have been involved. The case generated over 18,000 tips over the years. DNA evidence from the crime scenes has been preserved and tested as technology improved. Familial DNA and genetic genealogy have been employed. In recent years, investigators have continued following leads, re-interviewing witnesses, and applying new forensic techniques. But no arrest has been made. The victims' families formed support networks and advocacy groups. Timothy King's father, Barry, became a prominent voice for victims' rights before his death in 2020. He never stopped pushing for answers, never stopped believing justice was possible. The families of all 4 children have lived with this unsolved tragedy, knowing their children's killer was never caught. The Oakland County child killer case remains open. The Michigan State Police still accept tips and investigate leads. Somewhere in case files or DNA databases or someone's memory might be the key to solving these murders. But after nearly 50 years, that key remains elusive. And speaking of cases where someone terrorized a community with messages and threats that were never fully explained, let me tell you about a small Ohio town that received mysterious letters for nearly 2 decades. The Circleville letters, 1976 to 1994, 1976. Circleville, Ohio. A small town, the kind where everyone knows everyone else's business, or thinks they do. Then letters started arriving. Anonymous letters typed on a typewriter, containing personal information that should have been private. Secrets, affairs, hidden relationships, things the writer shouldn't have known. And they kept coming for nearly 2 decades. The first letters targeted Mary Gillespie, a school bus driver, and her family. The letters accused her of having an affair with the school superintendent. They contained threats, warnings to end the relationship or face consequences. Mary wasn't having an affair, but the letters kept coming anyway. Her husband, Ron Gillespie, also received letters. So did other people in town. Dozens of residents found anonymous letters in their mailboxes, each revealing something personal, something embarrassing, something private. The writers seemed to know everything. They knew who was seeing whom, who had financial troubles, who had secrets they'd never shared. The letters were menacing, but also strangely accurate. People started wondering who among them could know so much about so many lives. Trust eroded. Neighbors suspected neighbors. The small town atmosphere turned paranoid and tense. Ron Gillespie was particularly affected. Where he became convinced he knew who was writing the letters. He started investigating on his own. In August of 1977, he told his sister he was going to confront the letter writer. That evening, he received a phone call and immediately left his house in his truck. Within minutes, he was dead. His truck was found crashed into a tree. He'd been shot once. His gun was found at the scene. The sheriff ruled it an accident, suggesting Ron had been reaching for the gun and it discharged, causing him to lose control of the truck. But many people, including his family, believed he'd been murdered. After Ron's death, the letters continued. In fact, they escalated. More letters to Mary, more letters to others, and then the writer crossed a line. Booby trap signs started appearing on roadsides. One sign, Chetra, placed near where Mary drove her school bus route, had a gun rigged to fire when the sign was disturbed. Mary saw the sign and reported it. When deputies investigated and tried to remove it, the gun fired. No one was hurt, but the intent was clear. Investigators focused on Paul Freshour, Mary Gillespie's brother-in-law. They believed he'd written the letters and created the booby trap. In 1983, he was convicted of attempted murder based on the booby trap sign and sentenced to prison. But here's where it gets strange. The letters continued while Paul was in prison. He received letters himself, mocking him for being arrested for crimes the writer claimed they'd committed. The handwriting and typing matched the earlier letters. Paul maintained his innocence throughout his 10 years in prison. He insisted he hadn't written the letters, hadn't created the booby trap, hadn't been involved. After his release in 1994, he continued investigating the case himself, trying to find who had framed him. He died in 2012, never clearing his name. The letters slowed after Paul's imprisonment and eventually stopped in the mid-90s, but they were never definitively solved. Who was writing them? If it wasn't Paul Freshour, who knew so much about Circleville residents, how did they gather their information? Why did they stop? None of these questions have clear answers. Various theories have been proposed. Some believe multiple people were involved, that copycat letter writers emerged after the initial campaign. Others think the real writer stopped out of fear after Paul's arrest and worried they'd be caught next. Some residents believe the writer was someone in a position of authority, someone with access to personal information through their job. But no evidence has emerged to prove any theory. The Circleville letters remain one of America's strangest unsolved harassment cases. For nearly 20 years, someone tormented a small town, revealing secrets and threatening violence. They drove a man to his death, whether directly or indirectly. They manipulated the justice system into imprisoning someone who may have been innocent, and then they disappeared, leaving only questions and a community that never fully recovered its trust. And speaking of cases that took decades to solve, let me tell you about a serial criminal who terrorized California for years before finally being caught through a technology that didn't exist when he committed his crimes. The original Night Stalker / Golden State Killer, 1974 to 1986. For over 40 years, he was a ghost, a phantom who broke into homes across California, committing terrible crimes and leaving few clues. He had different names depending on which police jurisdiction was investigating: the Visalia Ransacker, the East Area Rapist, the original Night Stalker. Eventually, investigators realized these were all the same person, and for 4 decades, he got away with it. The crimes began in Visalia in 1974. Someone was breaking into homes, ransacking them, stealing small items, and occasionally escalating to violence. Over 100 burglaries were attributed to the Visalia Ransacker. Then, in 1976, the crimes shifted to Sacramento and surrounding areas. The pattern changed. Now he was breaking in at night, attacking people in their homes, committing terrible crimes against women, while their husbands or boyfriends were tied up and forced to listen. He was methodical and terrifying. He'd case homes beforehand, learning the layout, sometimes even entering when residents were away to prepare. He'd cut phone lines. He'd bring pre-cut lengths of rope. He'd place dishes on the backs of bound men, telling them if the dishes fell and made noise, he'd hurt their partners. The level of planning and psychological torture was unprecedented, Over several years, dozens of attacks occurred across Northern California. Victims described a man of average height, athletic build, with a surprisingly high pitched voice, but descriptions varied. Composite sketches didn't match. He wore a mask. He was careful. Despite massive investigations, despite thousands of tips, he remained unidentified. Then in 1979, the crime shifted again. Southern California, Orange County area. Now he was killing. Couples were found dead in their homes, beaten and shot. The violence had escalated from home invasion and assault to murder, but the methodical preparation remained the same. He was still casing homes, still planning meticulously, still leaving minimal evidence. The last confirmed crime attributed to him was in 1986. After that, silence. For over 30 years, investigators worked the cases. Different jurisdictions slowly realized they were looking for the same person. DNA evidence from crime scenes was collected and stored. Databases were searched. Nothing matched. The Golden State Killer, as he came to be called when the cases were connected, had simply stopped or died or moved away. The trail went cold. Then, in 2018, something changed. Investigators used a new technique, genetic genealogy. They took DNA from the crime scenes and uploaded it to public genealogy databases, the kind people use to find distant relatives and build family trees. They got matches, not direct matches, but relatives, cousins, distant connections. From there, they built a family tree backwards, identifying common ancestors and working forward to find who could be the source of the crime scene DNA. So, the tree led them to Joseph James D'Angelo, a 72-year-old man living quietly in a Sacramento suburb. He was a former police officer. He'd worked in Auburn and Exeter during the time the crimes were being committed. He'd been fired from the Exeter Police Department in 1979 for shoplifting. After that, he'd worked in distribution at a grocery chain and retired. He was a grandfather, a neighbor, someone who'd lived among the communities he'd terrorized. Investigators surveilled him. They collected his DNA from items he'd discarded. It matched. In April of 2018, they arrested him. The shock rippled through law enforcement and the communities he'd victimized. The man who'd committed at least 13 murders, over 50 assaults, and over 100 burglaries had been living a normal life for decades. He'd been a police officer, someone who understood investigations and how to avoid them. D'Angelo pleaded guilty in 2020 to avoid the death penalty. He was sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole. Victims and their families finally got to confront him in court, to see the face of the man who'd destroyed their lives. Some said it brought closure. Others said no sentence could undo the damage he'd caused. The Golden State Killer case was solved after 40 years. But the gap between his crimes and his capture represents a failure of justice. For 40 years, he walked free while his victims suffered. The case was only solved because of new technology, because of genetic genealogy that didn't exist when the crimes occurred. So, without that, he might never have been caught. And speaking of modern mysteries that remain unsolved, despite our advanced technology, let me tell you about an airplane that vanished in 2014 and has never been found. Malaysia Airlines Flight 370, 2014. March 8th, 2014. A Boeing 777 departed Kuala Lumpur International Airport, heading for Beijing. Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 carried 239 people, 227 passengers, and 12 crew members. It was a routine red-eye flight, the kind that happens thousands of times every day around the world. Within hours, the plane had vanished, and 10 years later, we still don't know exactly what happened. The last normal communication from the cockpit came at 1:19 in the morning. The pilot said goodnight to Malaysian air traffic control as the plane crossed into Vietnamese airspace. That was it. The plane's transponder, the device that sends identifying information to air traffic control, was turned off. The plane disappeared from civilian radar. No distress signal, no indication of trouble, just silence. But military radar told a different story. The plane hadn't crashed or exploded. It had turned around. Instead of continuing northeast toward Beijing, it flew back across Malaysia, then turned northwest, eventually heading out over the Indian Ocean. Someone in that cockpit deliberately changed course, turned off communication systems, and flew the plane in a completely different direction. The question that's haunted investigators ever since: who and why? The initial search focused on the South China Sea along the plane's planned route. When military radar data revealed the turn, the search shifted to the Andaman Sea and eventually to the remote southern Indian Ocean. The search area was enormous, thousands of miles from land, in some of the deepest and most remote waters on Earth. Finding debris in those conditions is like looking for a specific grain of sand on a beach that stretches to the horizon. Satellites had detected automatic pings from the plane's engines, signals that helped narrow down possible locations. Analysis suggested the plane flew for hours after turning off course, eventually running out of fuel and crashing into the ocean somewhere along an arc in the southern Indian Ocean. But where exactly? The search area covered tens of thousands of square miles of deep water. So, the underwater search became the most expensive in aviation history. Ships equipped with sonar scanned the ocean floor. Autonomous underwater vehicles dove deep, mapping the terrain, looking for wreckage. They found old shipwrecks, underwater mountains, geological features no one knew existed. But no Boeing 777. After 2 years and over $160 million, the official search was suspended in January of 2017. Meanwhile, debris started washing up on beaches. In July of 2015, a piece of wing called a flaperon was found on Reunion Island in the western Indian Ocean. It was confirmed to be from Flight 370. Over the next few years, more pieces were found on beaches in Madagascar, Mozambique, South Africa, and other locations. Ocean current analysis showed these pieces could have drifted from the suspected crash area. But the main wreckage, the part that would contain the flight data recorder and cockpit voice recorder, the part that could tell us what happened, has never been found. Theories about what happened range from mechanical failure to pilot actions to elaborate hijacking scenarios. Some believe the pilot deliberately crashed the plane, though his family and colleagues found this hard to believe. Others think a catastrophic fire or decompression occurred, incapacitating everyone on board while the plane flew on autopilot until it ran out of fuel. Some theories involve hijacking or terrorism, though no group claimed responsibility and no evidence supports this. The mystery is compounded by the deliberate nature of some actions. The transponder didn't fail, it was turned off. The course change wasn't a navigation error, it was a deliberate turn. Someone in that cockpit made decisions that led the plane away from its destination. But who and why remain unknown. Private searches have continued. In 2018, a U.S. company searched additional areas but found nothing. In 2024, new analysis of satellite data suggested a more specific crash location, and plans for renewed searches were discussed. But as of now, the main wreckage of Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 remains lost somewhere in the Indian Ocean. 239 people vanished that night. Families were left without answers, without bodies, without closure. The mystery of what happened in that cockpit, why the plane turned around, where it went, and where it finally came to rest in the dark waters of the Southern Ocean may never be fully solved. In an age of constant surveillance, GPS tracking, and global connectivity, A massive aircraft carrying hundreds of people simply disappeared. And that fact alone is perhaps the most unsettling part of all. And there you have it, 25 mysteries that remain unsolved despite decades or centuries of investigation. From Roanoke Island in 1590 to the Indian Ocean in 2014, these cases remind us that the world still contains genuine mysteries. Real people who vanished, real crimes that were never solved, real questions that may never have answers. Some of these cases might still be solved. DNA technology keeps improving. Databases keep growing. Someone somewhere might remember something crucial. But others might remain mysteries forever, puzzles that time and circumstance have rendered permanently unsolvable. So tonight, as you drift off to sleep, be grateful for the mundane certainty of your own life. You know where you are, you know who you are. You're not a cryptic message carved into wood or a plane that disappeared over the ocean. You're here, safe and accounted for. And honestly, in a world full of unsolved mysteries, that's something worth appreciating. Sleep well.